Hi everyone, I'm going to walk you through the solution for problem 4 in chapter 45. In my book, that's on page 432. So as always, I've created a documentation page and I have saved this file on my OneDrive. So we're provided with some data about two different hospitals, the emergency room and Chicago Hope. We're given risk categories and patient outcomes, either live or die. And the question that we're asked to use this data to determine which hospital is doing a better job of caring for heart attack patients. And we're given a hint to use all of the data. So we're going to use pivot tables to solve this problem. So I'm going to click on A1 and I will hold down Control Shift. And then with my other hand, I'm going to use the right arrow. And then I'm going to use the down arrow. That lets me select all my data. So now I will, along the top ribbon, choose Insert Pivot Table. So I can drop a pivot table wherever I like. In this case, I'm going to choose where the report will be placed. I'm going to put it into an existing worksheet. And the location that I'll select is right here. And I'll say OK. So now you'll notice along the right-hand side, we now have pivot table fields. And so in our data, we have a hospital column, risk, category, and outcome. And you'll notice each of those column names is located or is contained right here. So now I can drag and drop these column headers into the various pivot table fields. And what I would suggest when you're getting started with pivot tables is to kind of play around with it and sort of see what happens when you drop one of the fields into one of the boxes. So let's start by clicking on hospital. And so I'm going to select it by clicking my a left click on my mouse. And I'm going to hold that and drag it all the way down to rows. Now, see on my way down how there's a green line on filters, and watch as I continue to pull down. Now I see it in rows, and that's where I want to drop this. Okay, now you'll notice over here we have the beginning of our pivot table. So we have each hospital listed. So let's now drag outcome to our columns. Okay, same thing. I'm going to select it by left clicking and drag that all the way down to columns. So now I see I have each hospital and I have the outcome of living or dying. So now is a good time for us to apply our best practices. Column labels, really, that is outcome. And row labels, that's really hospital. Okay, now the problem is we don't have any data in here. So what I would like Excel to do is to report the data for how many patients lived and died from each of those hospitals. So outcome, I will select it again and I will drag it down to the values section. So now it has included a count of how many patients have lived and died. So there have been 203 patients at Chicago Hope, and of those 203, 169 lived and 34 died. Okay. For the emergency room, there were 200 patients, 165 of them lived and 35 died. It would be more meaningful to me if I could see this presented in a percentage form. And luckily, pivot tables make that so easy to do. So right here, we have the values section of our pivot table. And to the right of the title count of outcome is a down arrow, little arrow pointing down. Let's click on that. And we have some options here. What I would like to do is go into value field settings. It's the last option. So when we do that, we have a number of options. So right now, Excel is counting the number of deaths and the number of people who lived. If it was a numeric value, Excel could perform a sum or average, min, max, and so on. In this case, it's a text value, so those functions won't be helpful to us. But if you look here, we can select a different way to display the values. So show values as, I'm going to click on that. And right now, there's no calculation, but I'm going to click on the arrow to the right here, another little down arrow. And when I do that, I have the option to express this as a percentage. Now, you have to think about how the percentage should be calculated. And so when we looked at the data, let's see if I can move this box over. We see that the way we read the data is that at Chicago Hope, of the 203 total patients, 169 lived and 34 died. So I want to represent the percentage across the row. And so here we go, percentage of row total. That won't always be the case. It depends on the data that you're working with and the data that you're displaying. So you're going to have to use your judgment. In this case, we would not want to express it in terms of the column total because that doesn't make any sense. That's not where the relationship exists. In this case, the relationship exists along the rows. Okay, so percentage of row total, and I'll click OK. Now you'll notice all of our data has been converted into percentages. So when we look at this, we see 83% of the patients that go to Chicago Hope live, and only 82% of the patients that go to the ER live. Excuse me. So at first glance, we might think Chicago Hope is where we would have a better chance of living. But there's more to the story than that. And in fact, we're asked to use all of the data. So let's do that. Okay, let's create another pivot table. And so I'm going to select this data again. And I'm going to insert a pivot table. I'm going to select where that pivot table is placed. So it will be to an existing worksheet, and I'll place it right here. And I'll say OK. So I'm going to create the very same pivot table that we have above, except I'm going to make an addition to that pivot table. So remember, our first step was we dragged hospital down to the rows section, and we put outcome under columns and outcome under values. We changed the value field settings to show values as a percent of the row total. Okay, and I'm also going to update this title. I'm not going to update the row labels just yet. And if you found that that was a bit fast, you can pause it, pause this video while you catch up, and you can kind of rewind. But I just repeated the first steps that we did in the first pivot table. But this time I'm going to add risk category. Whoops, so don't worry if this happens. I just happened to click off the pivot table. You can click right back on the pivot table and it will bring your pivot table fields up to the right. Okay. So I want to add the risk category. Now, when I clicked on it, it added it right in. But what I actually wanted to see was the risk category as the main category and then the hospital underneath. So let's take a closer look. Under rows, you can see now I have an up and down arrow. The very first thing we see is hospital. And if I click this down arrow, you see risk category. I actually want risk category above hospital. So I can click on it and hold it and move it up. Now, see how it's become a green bar? I can move it to filters if I wanted to, or to columns. And as I make this move, see how the green bar appears. That's how you know where Excel is going to place it. Where I really want it is in rows above hospital. Now I'm going to release my mouse, and you can see it has changed. So let's take a look now. Instead of our row labels being only hospital, in this case, it is hospital and risk category. So for high risk patients, we can see that 80% of high risk patients that go to the emergency room live, compared to only 68% of high risk patients surviving at Chicago Hope. Now, for low risk patients, 92% live when they go to the emergency room versus 85% who live that go to Chicago Hope. So this is actually presenting a bit of a different story to us. And I now wonder if part of the story has to do with how many high risk patients go to the emergency room versus Chicago Hope. We can create a pivot table to look at that. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to insert a pivot table, and I'm going to put it right in the same existing worksheet. Put it right here, and I'll say OK. So in this case, what I would like to see, again, are the hospitals as the row column. But this time, I want to see the risk category as the column. OK. And we also need the risk category as the values. Oops. Try again. There we go. Again, Excel has just shown us a count of these numbers, and I'd like to see it expressed as a percent. So we know how to do that. I'm going to go to the values section, and to the right of count of risk category, I'm going to select that down arrow, and I'll go to value field settings, show values as a percentage of the row total. Okay, so now we see that the ER gets 80% of the high risk patients, and only 20% of their patients are low risk. And Chicago Hope, almost 90% of their patients are low risk and 10% are high risk. So let's call this risk category. And this is hospital. So these pivot tables let us get a little bit more of a complete picture. So we can see that, and this makes sense to us, if we have a very high risk issue, an emergency, we're going to go to the emergency room versus going to a hospital. So most of the patients at the emergency room, or 80%, are high risk patients, whereas for the hospital, only 10% are high risk patients. And so we can see that when we look at high risk patients versus low risk patients, in both cases, the very best outcome is coming from the emergency room. So it's very important that we look at all of the data when we're trying to analyze the quality of care. Had we have only completed this one pivot table, we might have said, I think we would have said, that it would be preferable to go to the hospital. You would have a better outcome. Yet when we dissect the data, when we look at it more carefully and we look at all of the data, we can see that in fact, most patients at the emergency room are high risk patients. Okay, and that makes sense to us that more people who are severely at risk or at the highest risk would go to the emergency room versus going to the hospital. And in the case of high risk or low risk, you have a better chance of living when you go to the emergency room. Okay, so that completes the solution for this exercise.